The release of the Sega Genesis, TurboGrafx-16, and many other home consoles in the late 1980s did so with one goal in mind: beat Nintendo. Or at the very least, try to establish some presence in the world of video games outside of the shadow of the Big N. Nintendo, however, wasn't going to let others just pass them by. A new console was being worked on under lock and key at Nintendo, as designers worked on crafting a successor to the Famicom and NES. This is the story of the Great Console War, the tale of Nintendo and Sega's fierce rivalry during the 1990s. In this part, we'll be changing sides to look at Nintendo and their new 16-bit console that will continue their reign over the console market. In the early 1980s, the North American video game market was thriving. Coin-op arcade machines and home consoles designed with interchangeable cartridges were dominating young gamers' time and wallets. The good times wouldn't last forever. In 1983, the North American video game market crashed, as gamers turned away from arcades and purchased less software for consoles like the Atari 2600. The revival of games in the region came from an unlikely source: Nintendo, a Japanese game developer. First founded in the late 19th century, Nintendo survived many of the hardships Japan faced over the last century. In 1985, Nintendo released the Nintendo Entertainment System as a limited launch in New York City to test the waters of the North American video game market following the Great Crash. Bundled alongside now classic titles, the NES quickly grew in popularity throughout 1986. With aggressive marketing, a killer lineup of games, and publishing policies that discouraged competitors, Nintendo's hold over North America grew to the point where they controlled over 90% of the video game market in the region. Nintendo's subsidiary in the region, Nintendo of America, grew from a small warehouse in the mid-80s to a powerhouse of licensing by the end of the decade. Nintendo's dominance was challenged, of course. The TurboGrafx-16 and Sega Genesis released in North America in 1989, bringing with them advanced hardware that put the NES to shame. The system still had legs, however. In 1990, the highly anticipated Super Mario Bros. 3 kept gamers glued to Nintendo, despite being on outdated hardware. In Japan, Nintendo's grip was beginning to slip. Super Mario Bros. 3 released in 1988 to critical and commercial success, but the Famicom was struggling against the more powerful Mega Drive and PC Engine, the Japanese equivalent to the Genesis and TurboGrafx-16. New hardware was already being worked on at Nintendo when these new consoles came out, but their success had Nintendo's R&D team go into overdrive to get a successor to the Famicom and NES out as soon as they could. The first details the public would hear of a Famicom successor came in 1988, when Nintendo president Hiroshi Yamauchi revealed the specs for the new system, alongside a handful of new games. Among these titles were sequels to major hits on Nintendo's 8-bit machine, notably Super Mario Bros. 3 and Dragon Quest V. A year later, in July of 1989, Nintendo held a press event to showcase their new system, now known as the Super Famicom. Greater details on the system's hardware was revealed, and Nintendo showcased an early prototype of the system to Japanese press. Super Mario Bros. 4, now known as Super Mario World, and a game titled Dragonfly, an unreleased predecessor to Pilot Wings, were shown off for the console. Unfortunately, the Super Famicom was delayed indefinitely following the reveal, giving Sega and other console manufacturers plenty of time to continue their rule over the 16-bit gaming scene. In late 1990, Nintendo released their first new home console in 7 years with the Super Famicom in Japan. Nintendo's push to release their own new hardware came off the back of Sega and NEC's new 16-bit consoles. Retailing at 25,000 yen, the new console housed more colors, a better sound chip, and improved graphics over Nintendo's 8-bit machines. Although the launch lineup was small, only having 2 games, the Super Famicom was an instant success in Japan and kept Nintendo on top in their home country. 300,000 units were made available to retailers on day one, with all of them being sold out within a few hours. While Nintendo was successful in Japan, North America proved to be their more lucrative operation. In 1990, more Americans had an NES in their home than personal computers, with some estimating that as many as 30% of all US households owned the Nintendo console. To say that Nintendo had a strong foothold in North America would be an understatement. Sega's push into North America didn't go unnoticed by Nintendo. With the successful Japanese launch of the Super Famicom, all eyes turned to the West. Like the NES before it, Nintendo opted to redesign the Super Famicom for the North American market. This redesign wouldn't be as drastic as that of the NES, however. Nintendo brought the Super Nintendo to the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in 1991 in advance of the console's release. Many gamers got their first chance to try out the new system here and experience Nintendo's take on a 16-bit console. Nintendo wasn't alone at CES that year. Sega was bringing their games in full force, alongside other third-party developers. Sega was ready to prove that the Genesis was a real powerhouse in the region. Nintendo's focus, however, wasn't on Sega, but their own trade deals. When creating the Super Famicom, Nintendo opted to use a sound chip designed by Sony. This strong relationship between the two developers was meant to continue. At the summer CES event of 1991, Sony unveiled the PlayStation. Unlike the system we know about today, this version of the PlayStation was based on the Super Famicom. Not only did it play Super Famicom games, but it had a built-in CD-ROM player, showing that both Sony and Nintendo were looking to the future. The next day, Nintendo announced that they would be partnering with Philips rather with Sony. The blow came in part due to Sony's contract regarding the PlayStation that would give the company a cut of every disc sold for the system, cutting out Nintendo's profits on the console. Others, however, have noted that Nintendo never really wanted to partner with Sony, and opted out in an attempt to keep Sony out of the home console market. A CD-ROM for the Super Nintendo never materialized. Instead, games licensed out by Nintendo were made for the Philips CDI system. 6 games were released on the CDI featuring Nintendo characters, 3 from the Super Mario series, and the other 3 coming from The Legend of Zelda. All 6 titles are best remembered now as poor interpretations of their respective series and generally bad games. In North America, the Super Nintendo Entertainment System launched on August 23, 1991. The system retailed for $199.99 and came bundled with a copy of Super Mario World, the latest adventure from Nintendo's popular plumber. F-Zero, a racing game, was available on launch day as well, just like it was in Japan. 3 additional games came out for the system too. Nintendo published Pilot Wings and SimCity, while Konami released Gradius 3. Despite the sparse lineup, the variety and quality of games impressed those who could get their hands on the system. Nintendo's confidence in their new home console shouldn't be understated. Despite Sega's recent efforts, the Genesis still didn't have the full reach of Nintendo's products. The later release of the Super Nintendo also helped Nintendo beef up their new system. By most metrics, the Super Nintendo proved to be more powerful than the Genesis. Nintendo even spent a considerable amount of energy showcasing Mode 7. This graphical showcase allowed for rotating and scaling of backgrounds to give a 3D effect. Titles like Pilot Wings and F-Zero featured Mode 7 prominently in many of their game modes. The holiday shopping season for 1991 was a strong one for video games. Sega with Sonic the Hedgehog, and Nintendo with Super Mario, alongside dozens of other high-profile games released for the Genesis and Super Nintendo. Sonic was Sega's biggest game of the year, and Sega rode that wave of momentum with a port of their arcade classic Outrun, once again showcasing the Genesis's speed. Sega also continued to release original titles for the Genesis, and began many of their most beloved series on the system. Decap Attack, Streets of Rage, Shining in the Darkness, and Toe Jam and Earl all hit the Genesis in September and October of 1991. Sega didn't want to be slowed down by Nintendo anymore. Third-party publishers were also releasing new games for the system. One of the Genesis's biggest supporters was Electronic Arts. EA had published games for the NES before, but the bulk of their titles were for home computers. After engineers at EA created their own development kit for the Genesis, Sega offered EA the opportunity to create their own Genesis cartridge, and release as many games for the system as they wanted. EA immediately began releasing games for the Genesis, including 1990's smash hit, John Madden Football. In 1991 alone, EA published more than 15 titles for the Genesis, including ports of The Immortal, Marble Madness, and John Madden Football 92. EA also published Road Rash, a racing combat game exclusively for the Genesis in September. Following the Super Nintendo's launch, Nintendo's only other release for 1991 was Super Tennis in November. The rest of the holiday lineup was left wide open to third-party publishers, many who were eager to showcase their new titles. Enix released ActRaiser for the Super Nintendo in November, although the game originally released on the Super Famicom a year earlier. Square and Konami both returned to the system with highly anticipated games. Final Fantasy II and Super Castlevania IV came out in November and December respectively, bringing two more massive hits to the Super Nintendo. Capcom doubled down on their support for the new console. A new beat-em-up called Final Fight made its way to the Super Nintendo in September. This was followed up by Super Ghosts and Goblins in November. The Super Nintendo hit the North American market in stride. The system had better hardware and better name recognition than any other console. Even with Sega's new mascot, the libraries of the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo seemed evenly matched after the 1991 holiday season. But for the first time since the release of the NES, Nintendo wasn't the winner of the big holiday rush in 1991. Sega's Genesis console had done what no other console managed to achieve before. Not only did the Genesis outsell the Super Nintendo in North America that winter, but it was holding a larger share of the 16-bit gaming market than any other competitor. Smart marketing campaigns, a price cut, and the pack-in game Sonic the Hedgehog pushed Sega ahead of the gaming giant like a true underdog. Sega's success, however, would not go unchallenged. They may have won the first battle, but for Nintendo, the war was just beginning. Thanks for watching. This is the second part of a multi-part series covering the great console war between Sega and Nintendo. If you enjoyed the video, remember to leave a like and share this video on your favorite social media sites to help this channel grow. Subscribe to catch the next episode when it comes out next week. In the next part, we'll shift to a new battlefront. We'll leave the living room for the outside world as Sega and Nintendo continue their battle for market dominance on the handheld front.